There's a church on a headland in southern Cornwall that has been there since the 13th century. It stands at the point where the Helford River opens into the sea, on a ridge of land thick with oak and sycamore facing south. From the tower, you can see the water below, grey-green and tidal, and the creeks that finger back into the woods on either bank. The creeks are long and still and dark with overhanging trees. At low tide, the mud is silver. At high tide, the water comes almost to the roots. For centuries, the tower served as a navigation point for fishing boats entering the river. The stone is dark with salt and weather. Jackdaws use the upper ledges. Beneath the churchyard, under the grass and the old graves, there is something older. An earthwork, a circular enclosure from the Bronze Age or possibly earlier, surrounds the site, still recognisable when the churchyard was extended in 1920. It runs around the perimeter of the churchyard as a low curved bank, following a line that predates the church by thousands of years. Before the church was built here, the place was already considered sacred. Before the saint whose name it carries, Mawnan, a Breton monk who arrived in the 6th century, the ground itself was already marked. The village is called Mawnan Smith. The church is St. Mawnan and St. Stephen's. The Lich Gate at the entrance, added in 1881, carries an inscription in Cornish. It is good for me to draw nigh unto God. On the 17th of April 1976, which was Easter Saturday, 2 girls walked toward that tower. Their names were June and Vicky Melling. June was 12, Vicky was 9. They were on holiday with their family, their father Don, their mother, and the day was mild, the kind of pale spring afternoon Cornwall offers, in the gaps between rain. Their parents were preparing a picnic somewhere near the churchyard. The girls went ahead. What they saw above the tower they described independently as a large bird-like human. A feathered figure, hovering. They ran. Don Melling found them distressed and frightened in a way he did not dismiss. When his daughters had calmed enough to draw what they had seen, he took them into separate rooms and asked them to draw it independently. The sketches they produced were similar. He looked at both drawings, and that same day he cancelled the holiday and drove the family home. That is where the story begins, with a father who believed his children enough to leave. What happened next, and who shaped the telling of it, and what exactly was seen above that tower are questions the Owlman of Cornwall has spent nearly 50 years refusing to answer. The summer of 1976 was the hottest in England since records began. The drought began in May and lasted into September. Reservoirs failed, rivers shrank to gravel. The grass on the cliff tops turned yellow and stayed that way. It was the kind of summer that makes England feel like a different country. Bleached, strange, a little suspended. Cornwall that summer was also, by some accounts, strange in other ways. A sea creature had been sighted in Falmouth Bay, enormous, dark, serpentine, photographed at a distance by a woman who preferred not to give her name. The photographs showed something long and humped breaking the surface of the bay. They circulated through local newspapers and into the paranormal press. The creature was named Morgor, after the Cornish word for sea giant. The man at the centre of those reports was named Tony Shiels. He went by Doc. Tony Doc Shiels was an artist, a magician, a self-styled wizard, and by his own description a charlatan and a thimble rigger. He was based in Cornwall in the mid-1970s and was in the small world of British Forteana, the magazines and newsletters that collected strange reports, unexplained phenomena, things that did not fit, a known and active figure. He staged events, he performed rituals, he had a reputation for elaborate operations that blurred the line between art and deception, and he seemed to find that line interesting in its own right. The Morgor photographs were never conclusively debunked, but no other photographs of a Falmouth Bay sea creature have ever been produced, and the woman who allegedly took them, identified in some accounts only as Mary F., has never been publicly identified. This is what you need to know about Tony Shiels before the story continues. He was the kind of man who understood that a landscape could be made strange, and that strangeness, once planted, had a way of growing on its own. When Don Melling, at some point after that Easter holiday, found himself at the Penryn Steam Fair, he encountered Shiels. He told him what his daughters had seen. Shiels obtained a sketch June had made of the creature. He gave it a name. He published the account in Fortean Times, the primary British journal of the unexplained, then in its early years and hungry for well-documented British mysteries, and in a pamphlet called Morgor, the Monster of Falmouth Bay, which he circulated that summer. The pamphlet bundled the sea serpent and the birdman together as twin mysteries of the Cornish coast, 1976. The Owlman was born in print. The sightings did not stop there. On the 3rd of July, 1976, two 14-year-old girls, Sally Chapman and Barbara Perry, were camping in the woods near the church. They had heard about the Owlman, they knew the story. According to their account, they were sitting at their campsite when they became aware of something standing in the trees at the edge of the clearing. About 20 yards away, they said. A figure, as big as a man, with pointed ears and glowing eyes. It had what they described as black pincer-like claws where feet should have been. It did not come toward them. It stood. And then, before they could leave, it made a sound, a hiss or a screech that sent them running for the tree line. They reported the encounter to Shields. The following day, a girl named Jane Greenwood wrote a letter describing a sighting in the same area. Her account put the creature in a tree near the church tower. Man-like, she wrote, with a wide flat face, slanted red eyes and huge black claws. She had heard something before she saw it, a hissing in the branches. When she looked up, it was there. She reported to Shields. These were the sightings of the summer of 1976. 3 encounters, all within a few weeks of each other, all collected by the same man, published by the same man, and never, before publication or after, verified by anyone else. No journalist found the Melling family, no researcher spoke to Sally Chapman or Barbara Perry independently. The witnesses existed, as far as the public record is concerned, entirely through the mediation of Tony Shields, and this is where it stops being a local curiosity, because Gareth Medway, an occult historian who spent years tracing the chain of custody for every documented Owlman account, found something striking when he examined the sketches that multiple witnesses had allegedly drawn. They showed, he suggested, signs of having been produced by a single hand, not similar drawings made by different people describing the same thing, the same drawing, or something close to it. Medway noted something else. In his own words, witnesses claiming encounters with the Owlman were either Doc Shields or friends of Doc Shields or relatives of Doc Shields, or reported their sightings to Doc Shields, and to no one else, or else wrote letters describing what they had seen to newspapers and were never interviewed by anyone. Every single one. There were later accounts. In the spring of 1978, 2 girls identified only as Kate and Anne reported seeing a large birdman-like creature near the church. About 4 feet long, they said, with a pointed beak and enormous eyes. In August of the same year, 3 unnamed French girls reported a sighting in the same location. These were the last accounts, directly connected to Shields. After that, the story quietened. The summer of 1976 became legend. 40 Times printed letters about it for years. The Owlman became one of those specifically British mysteries that circulated through paranormal magazines and small press newsletters, never definitively resolved, never quite forgotten, a fixed point in the landscape of the unexplained. In the way of such things, the story became self-sustaining. Anyone who went to Mawnan Church and looked up at the tower had already half seen the Owlman before they arrived. Shields moved on to other things, but Jonathan Downes did not move on. Downes was a Cornish paranormal researcher and later director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, an organisation devoted to the systematic investigation of cryptid reports. He knew Shields, respected him in his way, and acknowledged plainly that Shields was, by his own admission, a charlatan. He wrote it down, he published it. His 1997 book, The Owlman and Others, opens with the problem clearly stated: Shields is unreliable, the source is compromised. And then the book continues anyway because Downes had found something he could not entirely file away. In 1989, a teenage boy on holiday in Cornwall reported a sighting to Downes. The description matched the earlier accounts closely. A 4-foot figure with a head of feathers, the body of a man, a flat face, and what Downes recorded as pincers where feet should have been. The boy had no connection to Shields. He passed his account to Downes pseudonymously and has never been publicly identified. In 1995, an anonymous marine biology student wrote a letter to the Western Morning News in which he described encountering something near Mawnan Church. The editor, Simon Parker, received the letter. The student never followed up. He was never contacted or identified. And that is the second layer of the problem. Not just that the original story was collected by a self-admitted trickster, but that the later stories, the ones that would rescue the case from being a simple hoax, are themselves unavailable for examination. They exist in notes and letters and pseudonyms. They are the kind of evidence that points somewhere without ever quite arriving. This is where the story stops being simple, because the church is real, the earthwork is real. And what happened on that headland on the 17th of April 1976 happened to two children young enough that nobody expected them to know what they were supposed to have seen. Vicky was 9 years old, June was 12. They ran to the family car and their father, who was there and who knew his children, cancelled the holiday and drove them home. That detail has always sat at the centre of the case like a nail in wood. It is possible to construct a theory that explains away every other element of the Owlman story. The convenient timing, the single source witness chain, the sketches. But Don Melling's decision to leave is harder. Parents do not cut family holidays short for the sake of a story they do not believe. Something frightened those girls. What it was is the question that is not closed. The most widely cited explanation is also the most straightforward. Church towers are among the most common nesting locations for barn owls in England. A barn owl launching from a ledge or the roof of a tower is, at close quarters, a genuinely alarming thing. Silent in flight, white-faced, with a heart-shaped face that registers as somehow wrong at close range, larger than most people expect, with a wingspan that can reach 90 centimeters. At dusk, or in the uncertain light of an overcast spring afternoon, a barn owl at close range is disorienting in a way that is difficult to describe until you have experienced it. Larger still is the Eurasian eagle owl, occasionally kept privately in England, occasionally escaped from captivity, with a wingspan approaching 180 centimeters, bright orange eyes and prominent ear tufts that look from a certain angle exactly like pointed ears. Standing on a ledge, it is approximately the height of a large child. In flight, at the wrong moment and the wrong angle, it is something else entirely. Joe Nickell, who made a career of systematic investigation into paranormal claims, found this explanation sufficient. The children were young, the light was uncertain, they were in an unfamiliar place, close to a stone tower known to housebirds. Fear does the rest. The word hovering, which appears in the Melling girl's description, is exactly the word you would use for an owl banking on an updraft above a roofline. The second explanation is the one that follows from Gareth Medway's analysis, and it is the one the evidence most directly supports. Shields had already demonstrated with Morgor that he was capable of constructing a sustained paranormal narrative with fabricated or staged supporting evidence, and that he found this kind of operation artistically interesting. He was not a fraudster in the ordinary sense, a man extracting money or building a career from deception. He was something stranger. A performer who had decided that the real world was more interesting when you added things to it. A landscape artist, but the medium was mystery. The most damaging piece of evidence in the hoax case is Shields himself. He said, "You mustn't believe a word I say." He said it publicly, to journalists, in print. He called himself a charlatan, a thimble rigger. He acknowledged the reputation and wore it without particular embarrassment. And what he appeared to want, from Morgor, from the Owlman, from all of it, was not belief exactly, but engagement. He wanted the landscape to be strange. He wanted people to look at the Helford River and the headland above it and feel something they would not otherwise have felt. Whether that constitutes a hoax depends on what you think a hoax is for. The third theory belongs to Janet and Colin Board, whose 1980 book Alien Animals examined creature reports through a lens of earth energy and ancient site alignment. They noted what anyone who visits the church notices. It is built inside an Iron Age or Bronze Age enclosure. The earthwork is clearly visible in the churchyard, well preserved enough to have survived intact when the grounds were extended in 1920. The site was sacred before the church. The church built itself into that sacredness, as churches throughout Britain so often did. The great ecclesiastical strategy of the early centuries was to take the already charged ground and consecrate it, not to compete with it. There is a pattern in the British landscape that has been mapped, argued over, and never quite explained away. Churches, standing stones, springs, and burial mounds that align across the land in ways that feel deliberate. Alfred Watkins proposed this alignment in 1925 and called the lines lays. The boards proposed that Mawnan Church sits on such a line, that the earthwork, whatever its original purpose, marked a node in a system of sacred geography that Bronze Age people understood and mapped in stone, and that this node still does something, still has some quality of place that the mind encounters as presence. What witnesses saw, on this theory, was not a biological creature at all, but a manifestation of that quality, a thing that exists in the space between an ancient landscape and the mind that enters it. Jonathan Downes gave this category a name, zooform phenomena. An entity that is real in experiential terms without being a biological animal, something that leaves no tracks, makes no kill, produces no physical evidence, because it is not the kind of thing that does. It is unfalsifiable. It is also, as theories go, the most Cornish. There is something in the county, in the standing stones and the mine engine houses and the coasts that have been killing sailors for as long as there have been sailors, that resists being made tidy. The boards were not naive people. They were making a claim about the nature of certain places, and they based it on the observation that certain places produce certain kinds of reports, generation after generation, regardless of who is doing the looking. And then there is the fourth theory, which is the dark one. The Mothman appeared in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in November of 1966. It was seen by dozens of people over 14 months. Truck drivers on the highway, couples parked by the river, a farmer in a field at dusk. It was large, winged, humanoid with red eyes. It made no sound except occasionally a screech. It did not harm anyone. And then the Silver Bridge collapsed in December of 1967, killing 46 people, and the Mothman was not seen again. John Keel wrote a book about it. The Mothman Prophecies was published in 1975. Keel's argument was that the Mothman was not a creature exactly, but something more like a signal, an entity that appeared at a location before a catastrophe, not as an agent, but as a harbinger. He proposed that Mothman-type entities were a recurring feature of the landscape, belonging to a category of phenomenon that crossed cultures and centuries. The winged figure, the omen bird, the thing that appears above a sacred or liminal place, and watches. The Owlman sightings began in April 1976. Keel's book had been in circulation for 1 year. The timing is not evidence, but it is the kind of coincidence that makes you look twice and then look at Shields, and then look away from Shields and look at the later witnesses. The anonymous student, the teenage boy, and wonder whether Shields built something, as artists sometimes do, that went on existing after he had left the room. The Owlman and the Mothman share almost every descriptive detail: the size, the wings, the eyes, the stillness, the tendency to appear at the same location repeatedly before vanishing. The difference is that Mothman was seen by people in many different contexts who had no knowledge of each other's accounts, whereas the Owlman's witness chain runs almost entirely through one man. But if you are generous to the later sightings, the ones that arrived after the story was established, from witnesses with no obvious connection to Shields, then you have something that looks, at a distance, like a pattern. And the question becomes, what is the Owlman of Mawnan in the grammar of strange events? What is a winged humanoid that appears above an ancient church on a headland above tidal water, and is seen by children and is never violent and is always gone before anyone else arrives? That question doesn't have an answer. Or rather, it has 4, and none of them entirely closes.